In 3. Poland system transformation. Until the end of 1989, Poland was a centrally planned economy. Almost all factors of production were nationalized, that is, owned and managed by the state. An exception was, for example, agriculture, where land was predominantly in private hands. By means of centrally coordinated plans, the government influenced the supply of goods and determined how much to produce, which methods of production to use, and what prices should be charged for the products. Nevertheless, outdated technologies and low productivity could not satisfy customer demand. The import of capital and technology from the Western countries in the 1970s, often financed by foreign loans, did not help much. Production continued to decline, but wages were increased to motivate employees to work more efficiently. Increases in the prices of products were unpopular and often caused protests. The imbalance between the money stock and output of production resulted in rising inflation and shortages of consumer goods. At the beginning of the 1980s, continuing shortages of all products forced the government to ration food and other consumer products by means of special coupons. To improve the situation, the government introduced reforms aimed at the decentralization of the economy and giving enterprises more freedom to decide about their finance and production. However, these reforms were unsuccessful due to various reasons. Specially created workers' councils chose managers who yielded to their demands for higher wages, despite low productivity, which increased inflation. Also, a lack of market mechanisms, the poor quality of goods, and the introduction of martial law contributed to the failure of reforms. The last attempt at restoring equilibrium between the demand and the supply in the market was the liberalization of food prices in August 1989. Yet, indexation of wages above the level of inflation prevented any positive results and led to hyperinflation. After the electoral victory of the opposition in June 1989, the new government introduced an economic recovery program popularly called the Balcerowicz Plan, named after Minister of Finance and Deputy Prime Minister Leszek Balcerowicz, who prepared it. A package of 11 bills was hastily passed by the Sejm and signed by the President, and came into the effect on the 1st of January 1990 with the approval and financial help of the International Monetary Fund. The main reforms of the plan were abolition of price controls and most subsidies, a strict incomes policy to reduce high domestic demand and hyperinflation. A heavy tax was imposed on firms paying wages exceeding the approved limits. Special programs for the poorest, elimination of the allocation of resources by the state, and support for trade. Freedom to establish private enterprises in order to create competition in the market. Liberalization of international relations and import policy. Internal convertibility of the currency against the dollar at a fixed exchange rate of 9,500 zlotys, 0.95 zloty. Devaluation of the currency by 32%. An increase in bank interest rates to account for the level of inflation. Immediately after its introduction, the plan resulted in an 80% rise in inflation, a 30% decline in production output, a 50% reduction of the level of real wages, and a rise in unemployment. After a few months, inflation was suppressed, prices stabilized, and a new economic activity emerged. Street vendors began selling the goods bought directly from producers or brought from abroad. The increase in the number of small private enterprises and their production led to the reduction in the fall of gross domestic product (GDP) to 12% in 1990 and to 1% in 1991. In the following years, several more reforms were introduced. One of them affected the banking sector. As a consequence, the National Bank of Poland lost its central planning function and became a central bank independent of the government. Also, the state monopoly of PKO, Polish Savings Bank, and Commercial Bank, controlling international operations, was broken, and private commercial banks, both domestic and foreign, were allowed to provide their services. In the insurance market, the state-controlled PZU faced competition when privately owned insurance companies obtained permission to operate. Another reform allowed for the establishment of the Warsaw Stock Exchange and the Securities and Exchange Commission. As a result, it became possible to trade shares of privatized companies. Privatization of factors of production was another crucial element of the Polish transformation. Initially, the private sector grew thanks to small businesses that were opened or brought from local government agencies. In mid-1990, the privatization of larger state-owned enterprises began and continues until the present day. The following forms of privatization have been used in Poland. Direct privatization. All assets are sold to private investors, leased to an employee company, or transferred to a company with state treasury participation for further sale in the form of state treasury shares. Liquidation. Due to economic reasons. An enterprise is placed into liquidation and its assets are sold, transferred to a company with state treasury participation, or kept as a creditor's guarantee. General Privatization Program of 1993. 512 state-owned companies were transformed into sole shareholder companies of the state treasury, and their assets were transferred to special managing bodies, National Investment Funds, NIFs. Each adult citizen could buy one voucher entitling him or her to one share in each of the companies. The program is thought not to have been very successful, as the vouchers were later bought by speculative companies. Commercialization. An enterprise is transformed into a sole shareholder company of the state treasury, whose shares are sold to private investors, indirect or capital privatization, or are transformed to NIFs. Until the 30th of June 2004, enterprises owing money to creditors could be transformed into companies with creditors' participation and convert their debts into shareholdings. In 1990, there were 8,341 state-owned companies in Poland. By the end of 2004, 7,165 of them had been privatized. Since 1990, private sector production has grown considerably. In 2004, the revenue of private firms amounted to 80.2% of the total revenue in the economy. The remaining nationalized enterprises had been undergoing restructurization to improve their profitability. Economic reforms helped to transform Poland and put it on the road to a market economy, which was one of the requirements for the EU membership. To supplement the economic transformation, 4 additional reforms were introduced in 1991. Administrative reform divided the country into 16 voivodeships, 308 powiats and 65 town powiats, intermediate unit, and 2,489 gminas, basic unit. The reform was aimed at improving the work of local governments and bringing them closer to the citizens. Pension system reform introduced 3 pillars, types of savings, of which pensions will be composed. Payments in the first, state insurance company dues, and second pillars, often retirement funds, are obligatory. Third pillar payments are voluntary and may constitute an additional pension. Healthcare reform created 16 autonomous regional health funds responsible for financing the healthcare services of their members and 1 for uniform services. 7.5% of tax revenue was collected as national health insurance. In 2003, the National Health Fund replaced the health funds and the management of healthcare became centralized again. Educational reform reorganized primary and secondary education. Primary school lasts 6 years and secondary education is divided into 3-year lower secondary schools and several types of upper secondary schools. The latter include 2 to 3-year basic vocational school, 3-year general secondary schools, 3-year specialized secondary schools, and 4-year technical secondary schools. For graduates of basic vocational schools, there are 2-year supplementary general schools and 3-year supplementary technical schools. The goal was to adapt schools and curricula to the requirements of the Bologna process.